I knew the HOA was bad news the moment I saw Karen Vance marching up my driveway in her pastel pantsuit, clipboard clutched in her claws like a vulture ready to pick apart its next meal. I'd dealt with plenty of HOA nonsense before, but this time they'd crossed a line. I own a farm. A good, honest piece of land on the outskirts of their pristine little HOA neighborhood. My property was here long before they built their cookie-cutter houses, and yet Karen and her group of self-important busybodies always acted like I was an inconvenience to their so-called community standards. That morning, I was tending to my cows when I noticed something unusual. My fence gate was wide open. My heart dropped. I always locked that gate. I ran over and sure enough, fresh tire tracks ran right through the mud leading straight into my property. Someone had trespassed. Then I spotted it. A smug little HOA notice pinned right to my barn door. Unauthorized livestock presence near our community. Please ensure your animals remain contained or further action will be taken. I nearly crushed the paper in my fist. Further action? Was this a joke? My property was legally zoned for farming. My animals had never been on their side of the fence. But the worst part, the padlock to my back pasture had been cut clean through. Someone had let my cows out. I stormed inside to check my security cameras. Sure enough, there they were, Karen and two of her HOA cronies walking onto my land like they owned the place. I watched in disbelief as they snipped my lock with bolt cutters, swung the gate open, and then stood there, arms crossed, watching my cows wander toward the open road. That was the last straw. I wasn't about to let some overbearing HOA dictate what I did on my own land, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let them endanger my animals just to make a point. They wanted to mess with my farm. Fine. But they were about to learn that I wasn't the kind of neighbor to roll over and take it. I had a plan, and it involved every single one of my cows. I didn't waste time. The moment I had the footage saved, I drove straight to the sheriff's office. The deputy behind the desk barely had time to greet me before I dropped a flash drive in front of him. I told him exactly what had happened: illegal trespassing, property damage, and intentional endangerment of livestock. He plugged the drive into his computer and watched the footage with a deepening frown. "That's pretty damning," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They just walked right in like they owned the place." "Exactly," I said, "and they cut my lock." "That's destruction of property on top of everything else." The deputy sighed, rubbing his chin. "I can file a report and bring this to the county prosecutor, but honestly, HOA disputes like this tend to get tied up in civil court unless there's clear criminal intent." I folded my arms. "They let my cows out. If one of them had wandered onto the road and caused an accident, we'd be talking about a lot more than just a civil case." He nodded. "You're right. The best I can do right now is issue them a formal warning and make sure they understand they're on thin ice." I knew that wouldn't be enough. A warning wouldn't make Karen or her little minions stop. They were used to throwing their weight around and getting away with it. I needed a way to hit them where it hurt. That's when inspiration struck. The HOA had a clubhouse, a pristine, over-decorated building they used for meetings, social events, and their constant attempts to micromanage the neighborhood. They prided themselves on keeping it spotless, free of anything remotely resembling dirt or nature. I had plenty of both. That evening, after making sure my cows were safe and accounted for, I set my plan into motion. I called up a few friends, local farmers who had their own grievances with HOAs trying to push them out. After I explained what had happened, they were more than willing to help. We loaded a few trailers with my most stubborn, mud-loving cows and set off toward the HOA's prized clubhouse. By the time we arrived, it was late enough that nobody was around. The building was locked, but that wasn't an issue. The side gate leading to their manicured courtyard was wide open, just waiting for an unexpected visit. With a little coaxing and a few strategically placed buckets of feed, we guided the cows right through the gate and into the pristine, tiled lobby of the clubhouse. The moment their hooves hit the expensive flooring, I knew this would be a mess Karen would never recover from. One particularly large cow, Bessie, took an immediate interest in a decorative fountain in the center of the room. She promptly waded in, splashing water everywhere. Another spotted a table covered in HOA meeting notes and decided it made a decent scratching post. Within minutes, the place looked like a barn. I stood back, arms crossed, watching as my cows did what cows do best, completely disregarding the so-called order the HOA tried to impose. We didn't stick around for long. The security cameras would catch everything, and I wanted Karen to wake up to the reality of what happens when you mess with a farmer's land. By the time morning rolled around, I was already back on my porch, sipping coffee and waiting for the inevitable fallout. It didn't take long. A shriek echoed from the direction of the clubhouse, loud enough to scare a flock of birds from the trees. I set my mug down and strolled toward the commotion, trying to keep a straight face. Karen stood in the middle of the chaos, her perfectly styled hair in disarray. She was surrounded by HOA members, all of whom looked horrified. Muddy hoof prints covered the once pristine floors. Furniture was overturned. A few cows still lingered, lazily chewing on whatever they'd managed to find. The best part, the security cameras had caught everything. When Karen spotted me, her face turned a shade of red I hadn't thought possible. She stormed toward me, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. This is an act of vandalism. You'll pay for this." I raised an eyebrow. Vandalism sounds more like a case of trespassing gone wrong. Maybe if someone hadn't cut my fence, my cows wouldn't have been so eager to explore new territory. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She knew I was right. She knew the evidence was stacked against her. The HOA members around her started murmuring, some of them exchanging uneasy glances. I decided to twist the knife. "Oh, by the way," I said, pulling out my phone. "I already spoke to the sheriff. He has the footage of you and your friends trespassing on my land. You might want to start thinking about how you're going to explain that." For the first time since I'd met her, Karen looked genuinely nervous. She had spent years ruling over her little HOA kingdom, convinced she was untouchable. But now, she was standing in the middle of a disaster of her own making, with no way to spin it in her favor. I turned to leave, but not before tossing one last remark over my shoulder. "Next time, stay off my property." With that, I walked away, leaving Karen to deal with the mess, both literal and legal. The sheriff arrived within 20 minutes, and by then, the HOA clubhouse had descended into absolute chaos. Karen was pacing furiously, barking orders at a few of her more loyal HOA members, who were attempting unsuccessfully to herd the cows out of the building. The problem was, cows don't take orders, especially not from panicked suburbanites who have never been around livestock a day in their lives. One of the cows had knocked over a decorative lamp, while another had somehow wedged itself between two pieces of fancy furniture, chewing lazily on what looked like a shredded HOA bylaw pamphlet. The air smelled of hay, mud, and the unmistakable scent of farm animals. The moment the sheriff stepped out of his car, Karen practically sprinted toward him, flailing her arms as if trying to swat away invisible flies. She launched into a furious tirade, pointing aggressively in my direction, her voice so shrill that it carried across the entire courtyard. The sheriff listened, arms crossed, letting her rant until she finally paused to catch her breath. Then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. I handed him my phone, already queued up to the security footage. He watched in silence, his jaw tightening slightly as he saw Karen and her minions snipping the lock and trespassing onto my land. When the video ended, he let out a slow breath and turned back to Karen, who was shifting uncomfortably, her confidence visibly draining. Karen opened her mouth, probably to spin some excuse, but the sheriff held up a hand. He wasn't interested in hearing it. Instead, he pointed at the cows still making themselves at home inside the clubhouse. She looked around, realizing she had no valid defense. Her entire argument, her entire manufactured outrage crumbled under the weight of the undeniable truth. She had caused this. The HOA members who had previously been grumbling about the destruction now exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them started backing away, clearly wanting to distance themselves from Karen's mess. A few even muttered under their breath, looking disgusted with the whole situation. The sheriff turned to me. I met his gaze, keeping my expression neutral. We both knew I had made my point loud and clear. The sheriff finally exhaled and shook his head. He pulled out his notepad, flipping it open with the kind of tired efficiency that suggested he had been dealing with nonsense like this for far too long. He began writing up an official trespassing report, listing Karen and the 2 board members who had cut through my fence. A misdemeanor, but still enough to put a permanent stain on their records. More importantly, it was enough to force them to answer for their actions in a real legal setting, not just an HOA meeting where they made up their own rules as they went along. Karen's face had gone ghostly pale. She opened her mouth to protest, but the sheriff shut his notepad with a definitive snap, signaling that the discussion was over. The HOA president looked around, searching for support from her fellow board members, but most of them had already started inching away, unwilling to go down with her. She was on her own, and she knew it. The sheriff gave her one last look, then turned to me with a nod. With that, he walked back to his patrol car and drove off, leaving Karen standing stiffly in the middle of the ruined clubhouse, her reign of unchecked authority crumbling around her. The HOA members who remained started whispering amongst themselves, casting side glances at Karen. Some of them were clearly beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, they had been backing the wrong leader. I took my time gathering my cows, leading them out one by one. They had made themselves quite comfortable, but a few well-placed treats and some gentle coaxing got them moving. As I walked past Karen, I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The look of pure humiliation on her face was enough. By the time I had loaded the last cow into the trailer and turned back for one final glance, Karen was standing alone in the mess she had created, watching as the last of her power slipped through her fingers like dust in the wind. The fallout from the clubhouse disaster spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the time I had my cows back in their pasture, the entire HOA community was buzzing with speculation. Homeowners who had once blindly followed Karen's every decree now questioned whether they had been backing the right leader. I didn't have to wait long for the first real consequence to hit. That evening, as I was finishing up in the barn, I spotted a small group of residents standing just outside my fence line. They weren't the usual HOA enforcers, no clipboards, no stiff posture of self-importance. These were regular homeowners, people I had seen around but never had much reason to talk to. One of them, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, raised a hand in greeting. He introduced himself as Mark, a long-time resident who had grown tired of Karen's antics but had never had the leverage to push back. He got straight to the point. The incident at the clubhouse had been a tipping point. Residents were furious not at me but at Karen. Seeing her abuse of power exposed so publicly had shattered the illusion of her authority. The footage of her cutting my fence had made its way through the community, passed from neighbor to neighbor. Parents with young kids were livid that she had endangered animals that could have caused real harm if they had wandered onto the road. Others were furious that their HOA fees had gone toward repairing the damages she had indirectly caused. Mark explained that there was already talk of holding an emergency vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. The bylaws allowed it, but it required a majority of homeowners to agree. I could tell he was hesitant, unsure if I would want to get involved in their internal politics. But I had already been dragged into this mess. If getting rid of Karen meant I'd never have to deal with her nonsense again, I was more than happy to help. Mark and his group had a plan. They needed hard proof to push the vote through, something that would make it impossible for Karen to weasel her way out with technicalities. I already had the footage of her trespassing, but Mark suspected there was more. Several residents had long believed that Karen had been misusing HOA funds, funneling money into pet projects and personal expenses. The problem was, no one had ever been able to get their hands on the financial records. The HOA board operated in secrecy, holding meetings behind closed doors and refusing to share documents with residents. That's where I came in. Mark had managed to find out where those records were kept inside the HOA office, a small backroom in the clubhouse. Normally it was locked, but after the chaos from the cows, security had become lax. Some of the papers had been moved to temporary storage while the clubhouse was cleaned. If we were going to find anything, now was the time. I wasn't about to break into anything. I had already made my point with the cows, but I didn't need to. Mark had connections. One of the newer board members, a woman named Lisa, had grown disillusioned with Karen after the clubhouse disaster. She had access to some of the HOA's internal records, and she was willing to help. Under the cover of night, I met Mark and Lisa at the community center. Lisa had already retrieved a stack of files, flipping through them with increasing disbelief. Misappropriated funds, unapproved purchases, and invoices that made no sense. One document stood out: a receipt for landscaping services that had never been performed. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into a non-existent project signed off by Karen herself. Lisa shook her head, disgusted. She had joined the board thinking she could make a difference, but now she saw the truth. Karen had been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. By morning, the documents had been copied and distributed to key homeowners. By afternoon, the emergency vote was officially called. Karen didn't go down without a fight. She showed up at the meeting flanked by her dwindling supporters, trying to spin the narrative in her favor. She claimed the trespassing footage was misinterpreted, that the financial records were being taken out of context. But the residents weren't buying it. Too much had come to light. The vote was held and the results were decisive. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. The moment the announcement was made, she stormed out of the meeting, her face twisted in fury. She didn't even look at me as she passed. By the time the dust settled, the HOA had a new president, Mark. His first order of business: reforming the ridiculous bylaws that had allowed Karen to wield so much unchecked power. As for me, I went back to running my farm in peace, knowing that the next time the HOA tried to mess with me, they'd be dealing with a neighborhood that had finally learned to stand up for itself. With Karen officially ousted, the HOA had no choice but to pick up the pieces she had left behind. The clubhouse was still a mess. The financial scandal had thrown the entire neighborhood into disarray, and homeowners were suddenly waking up to just how much control they had allowed Karen to exert over their lives. Mark wasted no time in getting to work. His first move as the new HOA president was to audit every single expenditure Karen had authorized. Lisa took charge of compiling the financial records, and within days, they had uncovered even more discrepancies. It turned out that the fake landscaping invoice was just the tip of the iceberg. Karen had been siphoning funds for years, using HOA money for everything from personal vacations to expensive home renovations. The neighborhood was furious. Homeowners who had once defended Karen were now demanding she be held accountable. The board had no choice but to take legal action. Mark filed a formal complaint with the county, and within a week, an investigation was underway. Meanwhile, I focused on repairing the damage done to my property. The cut fence had already been fixed, but I wasn't taking any chances. I upgraded my security system, adding more cameras and better locks. If anyone from the HOA even thought about setting foot on my land again, I'd have the evidence ready before they could take their first step. As I worked, I noticed a change in the way my neighbors treated me. Before, I had always been the outsider, the farmer who didn't quite fit into their neatly organized community. But now, People were stopping by to talk, to apologize for not standing up to Karen sooner. Some even offered to help with repairs, bringing over supplies or lending a hand when they could. It was strange, seeing the neighborhood come together like this. For years, Karen had ruled with an iron fist, keeping everyone too afraid to question her authority. But now that she was gone, people were realizing just how much power they actually had. One evening, as I was finishing up in the barn, Mark showed up with an update. The county had launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's finances, and Karen was in serious trouble. Not only had she been caught embezzling funds, but it turned out she had also falsified documents to cover her tracks. If convicted, she was facing real legal consequences. She had tried to fight back, of course. She had hired a lawyer, claiming that everything was just a misunderstanding, that she had only been doing what was best for the community. But the evidence was overwhelming. There was no way out of this one. A few days later, Karen put her house up for sale. The news spread fast. Some people were relieved, others were just glad to see her finally facing justice. By the end of the month, she was gone. No farewell parties, no dramatic goodbye speeches, just a moving truck in the driveway and an empty house by the time the sun set. With Karen out of the picture, things in the neighborhood started to change. Mark and the new board members rewrote several of the HOA's most restrictive policies, giving homeowners more freedom over their own properties. The ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules disappeared overnight. For the first time in years, people actually seemed happy to live here. One afternoon, Lisa stopped by with a stack of papers and a grin on her face. She handed me a document, an official letter from the HOA board. It was a formal acknowledgement that my farm was legally zoned and exempt from any HOA interference. No more complaints about my animals. No more threats about my land. I had won. As Lisa left, I stood at the edge of my property, looking out over the fields. The cows were grazing peacefully, the fence was secure, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Karen had thought she could control everything, that she could bend the rules to suit her own desires. But in the end, she had only managed to destroy herself. And as for me, I was finally free to run my farm the way it was meant to be without an overbearing HOA breathing down my neck. With Karen gone and the HOA undergoing a complete overhaul, I expected things to settle down. For the first time in years, I could focus on my farm without worrying about some overbearing rule enforcement creeping onto my land. The new board, led by Mark, had done a solid job of dismantling Karen's ridiculous policies, and most of the homeowners seemed relieved to finally be free of her reign. But Karen's departure didn't erase the damage she had done. There were still loose ends to tie up, and as much as I wanted to move on, the mess she left behind had a way of creeping back into my life. It started with the legal proceedings. While the HOA had successfully removed her from power, the county's investigation into her financial misconduct was still ongoing. Mark kept me updated, letting me know that new evidence had come to light. Some of the fraudulent invoices she had signed off on weren't just about landscaping. There were also payments for contractors that never existed, maintenance projects that had never been completed, and even a suspiciously large payment to a consulting firm that nobody could verify. The county prosecutor had enough to move forward with formal charges. Karen wasn't just facing fines, she was looking at real jail time. Meanwhile, the HOA board had to deal with the fallout of her financial mismanagement. Homeowners were furious when they realized just how much money had been siphoned away, and the new board was left scrambling to fix the budget. There was talk of temporarily lowering HOA fees to make up for the years of overcharging, and Mark was working on getting some of the stolen funds recovered through legal means. But as much as the HOA was dealing with its own problems, I still had my own matters to take care of. The damage Karen had caused to my farm wasn't just about the cut fence. I had noticed that ever since the incident, a few of my cows had been more skittish than usual. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of being let loose near the road, but then I started noticing something else: footprints near my back pasture that didn't belong to me or anyone who worked on my farm. Someone had been sneaking around my property. At first, I thought it might be a nosy neighbor, maybe one of Karen's old supporters trying to stir up trouble. But the more I looked into it, the more uneasy I felt. The footprints were fresh, appearing almost every other day, and whoever was making them knew to avoid my security cameras. I wasn't about to let this slide. I set up new cameras, this time placing them in less obvious locations, covering the blind spots the intruder had been avoiding. I also reinforced my fences, adding more secure locks to keep anyone from tampering with them again. It didn't take long for my precautions to pay off. 3 nights later, I caught the trespasser on camera. When I checked the footage the next morning, I wasn't surprised to see a familiar face, one of Karen's old allies from the HOA board, a man named Richard. He had been one of her most vocal defenders during her removal, arguing that she had been misunderstood and that the neighborhood had been better off under her rule. But what was he doing on my land? I didn't waste time. I took the footage straight to the sheriff's office, just like I had done with the trespassing incident before. The deputy on duty took one look at the video and shook his head. Richard had no business being on my property, especially not in the middle of the night. Later that day, the sheriff himself showed up at Richard's house to have a little talk. From what I heard, Richard tried to play it off as a misunderstanding, claiming he had gotten lost while taking a walk. The sheriff didn't buy it, and neither did Mark when he found out. Richard was promptly removed from the HOA board, and a formal trespassing complaint was filed against him. With that last piece of unfinished business taken care of, things finally started to feel normal again. The HOA had been restructured, Karen was out of the picture, and my farm was safe from any more meddling. The neighborhood itself had changed too. Without Karen's constant interference, people actually started talking to each other like real neighbors. Some even came by to buy fresh produce from my farm, something they had never done before out of fear of breaking some ridiculous rule. It was strange, seeing the community come together in a way that had never been possible under Karen's rule. For years, she had kept everyone divided, making them believe they needed her authority to maintain order. But without her, the neighborhood was doing just fine, better even. Months passed, and eventually, the whole ordeal became nothing more than a memory. The legal case against Karen proceeded, and last I heard, she had taken a plea deal to avoid the worst of the sentencing. She wouldn't be going to prison for years, but she would be paying back every stolen cent, along with a hefty fine that would keep her from ever trying something like this again. As for me, I finally had my peace. I spent my days working the land, tending to my animals, and enjoying the quiet that came with knowing I didn't have to fight to keep what was mine anymore. And as I watched the sun set over my farm, the fields bathed in golden light, I knew one thing for sure: no HOA would ever try to mess with me again.